The next guest, please welcome the Honourable Senator Hassan Yussuff, who was, who was previously President of the Canadian Labour Congress and the first person of colour to lead Canadian Union. Third, we've got Chianga Puta-Chekwe, who is the President of Mosomo Education Foundation and former Deputy Minister for Citizenship and Immigration, as well as women's issues in Ontario. Chianga. Last but not least, our very own Sharon Hodgson, Dean of Ivey Business School. And we're going to call back Paul for action.
Clean one.
Thank you, Rommel. And the first thing I want to do is take credit for the title of this panel, The Upskill Climb. That was all mine. I'm delighted to have the panel all here in three dimensions. Thank you for, or congratulations on dodging the vagaries of our transportation system, which might be a subject for a Lawrence National Centre Summit next year. We have just heard a very animated and productive conversation about the labor force that's needed for tomorrow's workplace. And a key theme that's come out of that is that with all of the democratic changes, labor market transition, there is need for growing the labor force. And as almost every government in Canada can tell you, that's easier said than done. Let us start our discussion with a quick round robin on this theme. Where do you see opportunities for our labor growth and why? A few opening remarks, first of all, from Tabatha.
Sure. Thank you, Ani. Tabatha Indigenous, Indigenous, honor to be here. Thank you. You know, as we know and as was discussed earlier, the Indigenous population in this country is the fastest growing demographic in Canada. The stats say that 350,000 youth will reach the age of 15 between the ages of 2016 and 2026. But currently we know that education on reserve and for Indigenous populations in urban centres is critically underfunded. And until we're able to close those educational gaps, we are not going to be able to take advantage of the employment opportunities that Indigenous youth can provide. If we are able to close those gaps, Indigenous people could represent a fifth of the Canadian workforce. So a real significant opportunity there, but you know, we've been talking about closing the gap since the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples. There was an announcement then that we would close the gap within 20 years. In 2016, again, out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was another call to close those gaps on reserve. And now we've seen some funding in the last 2019 and 2020 budget, but yet to see where we're going to get on ensuring that we can first close those education gaps in order to ensure that we can get Indigenous youth into the workforce.
Okay, thanks for that, Tabatha. Chianga, what would you say are the opportunities and imperatives on this front?
Well, I'd certainly agree with Tabatha that more needs to be done to engage the Indigenous communities, because that's the only segment of Canadian population where the growth figures are right. It's the only segment of the population where you actually have youthful people, young children who become older children, who become adults and so on. So I'm very glad that Tabatha focused on that. But there is another area that's quite often overlooked, and that is the population over the age of 55. It's at the point we are at the moment, it's absolutely ridiculous to expect people to retire at the age of 55. Today's 55-year-old is not the same as 20 years, the 55-year-old from 20 years ago. It's a totally different person. We also have to factor in such things as biological age as opposed to chronological age. In a sense, retirement has to be determined on an individual basis, not on a generalized basis. So let me give you some interesting figures. You may remember, I always forget his name, Rick Minor, did those reports on people without jobs and jobs without people. At the time, his projection was that by 2031, Canada would have a shortage of 2.7 million workers. Now, that projection was revised, I think, around 2016, to show that, in fact, the shortfall would be just under 1 million. What had happened? Two things happened. One, more people over 55 stayed in the workforce, so they mitigated that loss. And secondly, we had a better immigration system. It's still defective in many ways. It's not perfect. And I am reluctant to associate our current immigration system with the word competent. But nonetheless, it is an improvement on what was there before. And so those two things combined to, in effect, give us more workers. And obviously, immigration is going to be the main source of new workers. But in relying on the immigration system, we must design it properly, and we must understand what the data is saying. It's not enough to simply say, let's bring in so many people with post-secondary school education. You've got to look at the kind of skills they have, and you've got to weight those skills appropriately under the express entry system. I'll give you an example. In Ontario, the province has been quite successful under the current Ontario Immigration Nominee Program. But more needs to be done. And one area they are concerned about is their ability, Ontario's ability, to attract that intermediate career individual. This is a person who should score very highly under the express entry system, but in fact scores less than their worth actually is. And the reason for that is this intermediate career person who has so much to offer has been in the workforce or has been working for 15 to 20 years. They have 15 to 20 years worth of experience. But the fact that they have that experience, the very experience we need, is a handicap when it comes to scoring them, because they are not young enough. You cannot have 20 years worth of experience and be 19 at the same time. So we do need to really be quite relevant, quite focused in assessing these attributes and in scoring people under the express entry system. Just one more point, if I may. Sure. Another area that we quite often overlook is women. And the issue here, I enjoy the music, by the way, thank you very much. The issue here is not that we have too few women in society. They are, in fact, the majority. But the issue is the gender pay gap. We've often looked at this issue as a political or even ideological issue. Having worked in government under all three political parties, I know some parties will pay more attention to this than others. We ought to look at this as an economic imperative. And why should we do that? Because we now know that the gender pay gap must be closed in order to increase Canada's productivity. Surely that's something that we would all benefit from. We are not doing women a favor. We are doing ourselves as a country a favor. We are doing what is necessary. And this is measurable. The benefits of closing that gap is quite measurable. McKinsey did a study with a very interesting title. It was called the Power of Parity, Closing the Gender Pay Gap. And their conclusion was, if one day we did close that pay gap, the benefit to additional global GDP, not just Canada, global GDP, would be between $12 trillion and $28 trillion. Thank you.
I don't think you've made your case. No. I take that back. Hassan, same question. Where's tomorrow's workforce going to come from?
I think I'll agree with Tabatha. First, the Aboriginal workforce that will be available is quite significant. And I think there's some good news. A lot of companies are recognizing this. There's a lot of upskilling, of trying to figure out how we get a youth from the Aboriginal community into trades, and that's happening better. We need to do a better job in how we can bring them in, but also mentoring them, because you just can't put somebody in an environment if people are not going to treat them properly and respect them in that context. So we have to do a better job at this, and I think some of that is starting to happen, and we can do more, but I think there's a need to be a broader recognition that this is a population that's already here. They want to work, and of course they want the support to ensure that they'll have a positive experience when they do come to work. Of course, the next is immigration. I think we have done relatively good despite all of our whining. We could do better. But the fact is, a lot of people are coming to the country. We've got a lot of students who come to this country every year. We figure out a way how to transition them from their student training to giving them opportunity to stay here and remain here in the country. And similarly, I think we're still doing relatively well in attracting people. Of course, the reality is we're not the only one not going to compete for immigrants. A lot of other countries are doing exactly the same thing. And I think we're going to be have to compete much harder to get immigrants here. And I think it's important for us to learn, despite the fact we're a country of immigrants, I think we've got a lot to learn. I mean, the areas in the world in which we're going to attract immigrants are mostly people of color from Asian countries, African countries, the Caribbean countries, where they're going to come from. We've got to make sure that the stories that are told of how people experience Canadian life, because they're going to have choice to go to other places. So I think we can do a better job than we're doing right now, because systemic racism and racism in general still prevent people. I think the important point on immigration too, at least public opinion seems to be on our side, that Canada still welcomes immigrants in the public, but that should not be taken for granted. That could change overnight, and I think we have to be always on guard how we respond to some who may want to exploit this argument to create division in our country. And the third point I would make is women. I think our agreement with the province on childcare is going to significantly increase women's participation in the labor force. And that is, I think, is a really positive thing, because again, we are lagging on this. Quebec has done far better across the country. The data that's been published shows what that contribution is made to the Quebec economy. And I think the rest of the country, now that we have a program that we can continue to build on, and will help more women get into the labor force market and not have to worry who's going to take care of their family or their children when they're not burdened with that responsibility to a large extent.
Okay, very good kind of tour d'horizon. And Sharon, to finish this opening round, how would you address this?
I won't repeat much of what the other panelists said, because they covered a lot of the underrepresented workforce today, with the Indigenous community, over 55, women, and also covering immigration. Obviously, we haven't mentioned the Black community, which is about 8% of the workforce, 8 to 12, depending on where you are in the country, and also underrepresented. I might take a slightly different spin at commenting, though, because I also would say those in the workforce today that are skilling out is also a place where we really need to focus, and that's the reskilling, the lifelong learning. Some of the statistics out there is that kids coming out of school, out of universities today, change their employer 2 times in their first 10 years, and they're changing their skills with each of those moves. They need to be reskilled, as well as people coming in from an immigration perspective. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and there's a lot of work to be done to build pathways for all of the different underrepresented groups right now to get them into the workforce today. The last point that I'll just quickly make is, it's come up a couple of times today, but it's related to entrepreneurship. And one of the jobs that I think that we can do really well, and a lot of the universities are doing this, is building that culture of entrepreneurship in our students that are part of our programs, and getting them to take risk, but also understanding how to build and protect IP and how to commercialize IP. And also to understand that most entrepreneurs aren't successful their first time out of the gate. And so it's okay to have small failures as you build and get to a successful business. And so it's just creating that culture of entrepreneurship that I think will also help to open up more entrepreneurs in the country and then fulfill even more jobs and help to drive growth.
Okay. So not only new entrants in the workplace, but making sure that the sort of standing workforce is constantly adapted and ready. Okay. Senator Yussuff, Sharon mentioned the notion of a pathway to transition for immigrants and newcomers. And I'm wondering whether you can address the next question, which is, as someone who's worked all your life to enhance the welfare of workers, what are some of the challenges in creating a pathway for immigrants into the workforce? And how could we address those obstacles?
Well, there are many. It depends on where you sit and of course, the opportunities you may have. I think a large challenge that we still face in this country, that immigrants who come with a great deal of education and background more often than not end up working in the field in which we recruit them to come here. And I think we need to be honest about this, as much as that some may not like it. Some of the professional organizations have not done a good job in how they accredited people to work in the profession. So I'll take one example, and in the moment of a crisis, as we've seen right now in healthcare, the Ontario government had to face up to the fact that there's thousands of nurses who've come from other countries, foreign trained, but yet we're not able to work in the field. And overnight, the government made a decision they're going to find a way to give those nurses an opportunity to be mentorship, but also to get into the field of healthcare. The question that I asked myself, well, why did it take a crisis to figure out a way we're going to push the envelope and push it pretty hard to say to the professional licensing agency, you're not going to do what we expect you to do. Either we'll take control back of this responsibility, or you're going to work with us to help move that forward. And I think for too long, friends, individuals that I know, in Toronto, there used to be a saying, and we laugh at it, we had the most educated doctors driving taxi cabs. So if you ever get in an accident in a taxi cab, you don't have to worry about getting to the emergency department, because the guy or the person who's driving the car will actually give you better health care before you can get to the emergency ward. Now, how is that possible in a country that are doing so much to try to bring people here? And I think it, as much as we sometimes kind of trivialize it, it really talk about the wasted talent we have. Now, I don't want to point blame, because that's not going to get us anywhere. I think fundamentally, because we are a federation, there is a fundamental challenge how this federation works, because it's not unique. What you may do in Ontario very successfully might take decades before it affects BC or Alberta or someplace else. I think we have to have a national conversation how those of us who care about solving these bigger questions, what can we do to help solve it? Because the minute you take your foot off the gas, we'll go back to the standards that's always been inconsistent about how we treat people in this country. And I think to a large extent, there is a crisis in the labor market right now, not enough people. I think we can do better, and it's nice to blame the federal government, but the federal government is not the licensing body at the provincial level. It is the provincial government, and it's them who have to take this responsibility. And too often, I don't think enough fingers have been pointed at them, say we need to do better. But those of us who have an interest in getting the policy right need to realize we can't just talk about this. We got to do more than talk about it. We got to push the envelope and challenge people to say we can do better. And I'll end at this other point in regard to the trades. If you're a mechanic in another country and you came here, the combustion engine is no different no matter where you go. It's the same. If you can wire a house, pretty well the same thing you will have to do in another country you could do here. We find a better way to give those people a quicker pathway to their profession, but we haven't done so in the so-called medical profession and others. And I think we need to, again, find a collective way how we keep this conversation going, but also bring the province to the table, because ultimately it's their decision that's going to change this reality. It's not the federal government. Despite the federal government, they're the one who decide who gets to come into the country to a large extent.
Okay. So on that question of credentials recognition, which is almost a perennial, Chianga, are you aware of programs that alleviate the transitional skills gap challenges for immigrants? Are there ways to hasten that path to the labor market for newcomers?
There are ways to do that, but I would first like to point out that we should think about what's really happening in the area of accreditation. I think there is a difference between, on the one hand, protecting the Ontario public or the Canadian public, and on the other, guild protectionism, where the guild is protecting itself from potential competition. Take the case of lawyers. Ontario law is based on English law, and I know something about that. And yet, a person who specializes in any area of the law, or doesn't specialize in anything, but is just a lawyer. Let's take the example of a person who practices intellectual property law, and we talked a bit about that this morning, and how desirable it would be for Canada to really protect its IP. You'd have a person from the UK, 10 years experience, they would come here, they would not be able to practice intellectual property law. Such an international subject, something they've done in many countries, they would not be able to practice it in Ontario. They would have to go back to university, or alternatively take an accreditation course, and then go to the bar. And in the meantime, their families will be fed miraculously. My sense is that God no longer provides manna. You know, this person has to live. So you really have to find a way for them to practice their professions very quickly. Coming back to your question, Ontario has a Fairness Commissioner. But the Fairness Commissioner's role is quite limited because she can only, it's now a he can only look at the practices of the professional bodies. Are their registration practices transparent? Are they objective? Are they impartial? Are they fair? You can tick yes against each one of those depending on the assumptions that you make, depending on systemic issues that may actually be injurious. You could even find these practices fair, and so on and so forth. So that is one small step in the right direction, but the Fairness Commissioner needs to be given more power. In terms of practical things that provinces can do, Ontario had and has a relatively successful bridge training program. What that does is address some of the issues raised by the Senator, which is we are not going to look at this issue in general terms. We are going to look at your personal and particular circumstances. We are going to look at your qualifications and come to an agreement as to what you know. So they'll examine this person, they'll talk to the person, go through the curriculum, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, they'll say, fine, we agree that the knowledge you have is equivalent to X, Y, Z, but you don't have P. So we are going to design a program to bridge you over so that you have the P qualification. And that has cut down significantly in certain areas where the regulatory bodies are cooperative. It has cut down significantly on the amount of time people have to wait before they can practice their professions. And if I may just give two examples. The pharmacists, for example, prior to the institution of the bridge training program, only 20% of them passed the licensure exam. A bridge training program was then instituted for them in cooperation with the University of Toronto, and it took about a year to do that, not the 4 years that they previously did. After that training, the pass rate for licensure went up because 90% of the students passed. The story with optometrists is the same in conjunction with Waterloo University. The pass rate jumped from 28% to about 83%. So these are programs that should be encouraged, and certainly they have worked. And what I think is required now is for all levels of government to get together, examine how this has worked, and how this can be made a national program.
I admit to some skepticism about the notion of the federal, all levels of government getting together to discuss anything these days. but perhaps hope springs eternal. Skipping lightly by that objection. Sharon, is there a role in boosting the intake of international students in higher education? Not only the total number of newcomers, and not only in terms of transition to the professional workplace, but international students.
Yeah. So let me start with a couple of statistics. First of all, the amount of international students that have grown in Canada has been, the growth has been huge over the last 20 years. Exception one year, the pandemic year, when we didn't bring in any international students. In 2021, there were just under 400,000 new students that were admitted into the Canadian schools that were international students. Yeah, seems pretty good, but the market out there right now is over 5 million students that are looking for a place to study. That really is about 7% of the market that we've been able to get. And so the market availability is huge right now. And that market of 5 million students is expected to grow by 50% by 2030, which means our opportunities are even more enormous to try to draw students in from an immigration perspective and international students. Most of them choose STEM, and the statistics here are very strong in terms of the number of students who get jobs. It's in the high 80s, high 80%, and many, many of the international students stay, even without PR status. Why do they pick Canada? They pick Canada because it's multicultural. It's considered immigration friendly, and it's considered to have a great quality of education. But there's a number of challenges as well. One, and probably the biggest one, is their lack of familiarity with Canada. We do not have a coordinated effort across the country to market Canada as a great place to get your education and come and work. Countries like the US and even the UK have done much more constructive work together to be out and in front of international students with this international strategy of recruiting. The second big issue has to do with visa delays and the high rejection rate. We've had huge visa delays, and it was all in the newspapers during the pandemic, but even before that, it takes us over 60 days to process a visa, and other countries 2 to 3 weeks. You know, a student who's waiting and they've got acceptances from 2 schools, when they get that visa, they're going. And the reasons why, and I'm going to go to this cross-purpose comment you made earlier on something else, but they're either considered lack of suitability for the program, even though they had the skills to get into the program as deemed by the university, or they had too much connected or limited connectedness with their home country. And so they were worried that they wouldn't go back. Well, the whole point here is we actually want them to come and to stay, and they want to come here because they want to stay. 2 other quick challenges. One is the tuition is high. I mean, we're subsidizing our domestic students to some extent with international student fees. And the scholarships available for the rock star international students, the really, really bright up and coming, they're almost non-existent. They do not get scholarships. And other countries are much more aggressive than we are in those types of investments. And then the last, someone had mentioned it earlier, but it's the PR challenge. When they're trying to figure out, if I go there, will I get my permanent residency? After 5 years after graduation, only 20% of the students have their PR status, and in 10 years, only 30% have their PR status. So we're not very welcoming in terms of, hey, we want you to stay, we want you to be part of this community.
Here too, when you talk about the challenge of marketing Canadian higher education on the global market, I get the impression that federalism is an obstacle, because every province, not only does every province want to have its own message, but some provinces are at cross purposes with other provinces in terms of the cohort that they want to attract, and which is a bit of a theme today, why I've been covering the need to market our higher education abroad for 20 odd years, and the success rate hasn't been improved. Is that a challenge?
I haven't heard that as much. I do know that different provinces are looking for slightly different recruits, but I actually don't even think provincially. Even provincially, we are not acting together to go out and market our services. So Ontario, across the university system, We have just started conversations where we're out together and trying to recruit for specific provinces or for the Ontario market. I think it's really university by university now, and we don't have the scale to be able to afford to do this on our own. We need to do something on a national level.
Okay. Tabatha, from an Indigenous perspective, is there also a mismatch between education and labor market opportunities, and are there ways to address that mismatch?
Yeah, I think I'll just take an example. So my son is in grade 12 and he wants to go into engineering. When I applied to engineering at Waterloo, I think the average required was 86 or something. It's now 94. We went to visit Queen's, and they have a really incredible program about Indigenous access to engineering program and Indigenous access to STEM to try to increase Indigenous students into the program. So my son has clean drinking water, he has fast broadband internet, he has an incredible social capital of people around him. He needs a 91 average in English, calculus, functions, physics, and chemistry to get in. And if you think about the children on reserve who are going to a school on reserve that's underfunded, that doesn't have digital, that they don't have broadband. So about 35% of homes on First Nations don't have broadband. So during COVID, when they were supposed to be learning from home, weren't able to. So we need to find ways that we can, if we really want to ensure that we're producing well-rounded engineers, as an example, and increasing those that are underrepresented and those that are really at the bottom end of the socioeconomic gap into STEM programs, we need to really look at our universities and how we're finding ways and alternative pathways to ensure that they're able to get into the program. But we also need to do a lot more work in the grade 7 and 8 to ensure that Indigenous students understand, like, what does it mean to be in the finance sector? What does it mean to be an engineer? I'm sure most people in this room know, but up until 1951, if you got a post-secondary degree, so if you became an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, you lost your Indian status. So you were no longer considered an Indian. You had to move off of the reserve, away from your family, away from your community. So we don't have those mentors. We lost Indigenous leaders that have those post-secondary degrees and experience. So we need to ensure that we're working with the really, really young people that are coming up so they just have an idea of what that opportunity even is. And if we look at the skills programs that are out there right now, so at CCAB we recently did a study called Readiness and Resilience that looked at the mapping of what supports are there for skills and employment training for Indigenous youth. They're very focused on social health care. There aren't a lot of programs that are focused on manufacturing and skills and STEM. So we need to really change that ecosystem as well. So we're just building that understanding of what it means and what opportunities are out there. Because kids these days have to make those decisions so early about where they're going to go and what they want to be. And if they don't have that experience or they don't have those mentors to see them, then they don't even know what the opportunities are.
Okay. All right, let's move on to another facet of this conversation with another question for you, Tabatha. What are the important challenges that hinder access to education and skill development for Indigenous populations?
So definitely, I can't say it enough. We need to ensure that there is equal funding, and not just equal funding today, but we need to understand how we can close that gap of the chronic underfunding that happened in on-reserve schools. And there is funding there, so hopefully that will start to improve. Of course, social capital for sure, but I think also, the lack of representation currently of Indigenous people in upper and middle management on boards and in executive suites, and this is the same for women in many underrepresented communities. The other key thing that we found was the value on formal education, so the value that employers put on that formal education, a post-secondary degree versus a skilled trade. Yeah. And I think also we hire so much about the capability or the capacity of this young worker, or what the worker's experience has been, instead of what's the capability of this individual. And that's the same on board recruitment. You have to have CEO experience to be able to sit on a board. Well, if we can't get Indigenous people into CEO and C-suites, we're not going to be able to fill those board positions. Instead, we need to be thinking about how does this person manage risk? How do they assess risk? How do they work under pressure? What's the capability of this individual versus where did they go to school and what's their degree, if we're really going to try to move that. And we've definitely seen that in some of our research. And I think also to the point about ensuring that those workplaces are comfortable places. So we need to ensure that we're providing a culturally safe space, that our organizations and industries and companies are really looking at what are they doing with Indigenous people to support Indigenous communities and businesses, how are they ensuring that they have done the required training and cultural awareness within their organization, so Indigenous youth and any Indigenous worker feel comfortable in that space. And then the other on the upskilling and automation, we definitely see that there's a very high percentage of Indigenous people that are in employment, that are in jobs that are at risk for automation. So looking again at that continual learning and how do we ensure that we're providing skills for people that are already in the workforce as well.
Sounds like there's a role here for peer mentoring, advocacy, individuals who've gone ahead and can help accompany the next cohort.
Yeah, I think there's also an incredible opportunity for internships as well, so that young Indigenous youth can go in and spend a day in a bank and understand what it means to be there. And it's a gentleman on my board who is currently leads an Indigenous program at Scotiabank, but he remembers going, when he was a young person, going to TD when Clint Davis was leading the role at TD Indigenous, and sitting there, and he tells this incredible story about sitting in Clint Davis's office and thinking, this is an Indigenous man sitting in front of me, and this is his office. Like, this is incredible. I can't believe he gets to work in this office every day. And just seeing somebody in that space, and now this gentleman is in a similar role, and he talks about how impactful that was. But I think it's also about, and I think this kind of a theme of the day, it really is about collaboration. So academic institutions, employers, and government, and us all really finding how we can build the proper ecosystem for that.
Maybe I can ask the rest of the panel, are there similar examples that can serve as inspiration or as concrete models for increasing participation? I see, Sharon, that you've got one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I agree with everything that you have said. When we had the Black Lives Matter movement, 2.5 years ago now, and other social movements around really trying to increase representation in the workforce of the underrepresented, immediately our recruiters came to us and said, fix it. And we looked at it and said, well, we don't have the pipeline for that. And so we started to think about where are we going to go to start to seek out more underrepresented communities in our programs so that we can help to develop these skills. And at first, Ivey started to work on it by themselves, and then we said, this is not a competitive advantage. This is actually just the right thing to do. We need to start working collaboratively. This is back to, we need to get at the provincial and at the national level. But we reached out to 2 other universities. Queen's was one of them, and Schulich was the other, the business schools, and said, we are going to teach students in the TDSB. We started with TDSB because it's the biggest school district in the country, to understand what it means to have a business career. Back to what Tabatha was saying. Most students, if they have no role models, no examples, think that you're either an entrepreneur or you work in a bank, and that's the only thing you can do with a business degree. And so it's educating them early about what a business degree can do, and then what are the skills that you need, what classes that you need to take in high school to be able to do this, and then build programming and academic pathways so that they can get the skills that they need and get the grades and understand what they need to get in. The next thing is understanding the financial supports. We have a really tricky financial system, support system, that you have to actually apply in a certain order for all the different financial supports to maximize the value. We had to educate them about first you go for this scholarship, then this, because if you go the other way around, you only end up with half the money. We then went back to the employers and said, we need you to help fund this because we're going to have to build these programs and we're going to have to build mentorships. And we started to speak with the banks. They're not yet fully engaged yet, but they've said they're interested in helping to participate in this and provide mentors for us. And then when the students come into the universities, we need to make sure that they feel like they belong there. And so it's really about building mentorship programs and making sure it's a safe, inclusive place to work. So we are starting to work on this. The program is called Up. It's very early in its stages, but I feel really good about the structure of it. We've run it for 1 year in the TDSB, and we're starting our second year in January, so we're excited about that.
That's really encouraging. Hassan, Yussuff, you had.
Yeah, I think another good example based on what my colleagues are saying here is the program the building trades unions have been running to get more diverse cohorts into the building trades, and this is called a community-based community benefit agreement, which they negotiate with governments about how you build infrastructure, and if they're going to be part of that. Part of it is also to offer apprenticeship to young people who would traditionally not be in that kind of work. So the recruitment around Black community, Indigenous community, and to a large extent to bring women in, because these are the areas in which there have been a lot of huge gaps in terms of people who don't want to get into the trade, but part of that means that they have to work to also change the culture, and this has now become a mainstream. So most provincial government, to a large extent, that get federal government money to build infrastructure, part of that means automatically there will be a community benefit agreement, and the agreement entails actually measurable achievement over time. How do you recruit? And in Toronto, a lot of at-risk kids in those communities are getting an opportunity now to get an apprenticeship, whereas before they would never have gotten that opportunity, because that's a prerequisite if you're going to access this money to build infrastructure. And I can tell you how many kids' lives have been turned around as a result, and now they have an opportunity. And similarly with First Nation communities, also figure out how to bring them in. And I think the bigger point that Tabatha has been making, we need to do a better job of how we can mentor and support the kids who come in. Because if you're coming out of your community to work in an apprenticeship program where there's nobody there, who do you relate to on the job site? Who supports you on the job site? And more importantly, who do you turn to if you need particular support or assistance to make sure you don't, this is very foreign to me, I want to go back to my community because I don't feel I belong here at the end of the day. So I think it's starting to show significant attraction for those who would never want to go into these kinds of employment, realize that you can make a good living, but equally you got a future, especially if you want to go into any one of these trades going forward. And I think the fact that governments are insisting that community benefits have to be part of an infrastructure agreement, otherwise we're not going to give you the money to do this. And I think it's really showing significant improvement in the recruitment that is happening, and I think we could do more of that in other sectors in the economy.
Okay. Just a note to everyone that one of the best moments in any panel that I moderate is the point when I stop asking questions and you start asking questions of your own. That moment is coming soon. So if you have questions on these topics for the panelists, you can start to get those ready. I do want to get back to the notion of upskilling. We've talked a lot about how to bring less traditional employees into the workforce, but then the question is how to keep workers current once they're in. And so maybe Chianga, I can start with you. How do we create systems that offer opportunities for lifelong and recurrent learning, and that enable our workforce to continually update their skills?
I think you have to, first of all, recognize the nature of the economy we are in. There is nothing stable about this economy. I think Stephen would agree with me on that point. Once you recognize that, you then understand the need for constant learning, lifelong learning, upscaling of skills, and so on. The one thing that must absolutely be done, in my view, is there must be a national strategy for education, immigration, and skills development. Not just for those three things, but for everything that's related to those three things. That means collaboration between academia, industry and government to, for example, make sure you have a viable system of mentorship, you have internships, and you provide incentives for companies to provide provide internships to existing students and perhaps to new Canadians as well. But there is another side to the equation, and that is a lot of these skills are going to come from outside. So Canada itself must be seen as receptive to foreign skills. And I think this was one of the points that Hassan was making. I'll give you an example. Ontario's immigration nominee program is considered successful. Ontario needs 18 to 20,000 individuals as human capital. The federal government last year only allowed them to nominate 9,000 individuals. So clearly, the provincial government and the federal government are not on the same page in that regard. Now, of the 9,000 nominated, guess where the people came from, the top 3 countries, the source countries. Number 1, by far, was India, about 2,000 and change. And this is a high-value human capital. Number 2 was China, about 1,300-700, thereabouts. Number 3 was Nigeria, 500. You then had Brazil and Pakistan tied at about 200. So again, going back to Hassan's point, we just have to get used to the idea that the profile we have of the highly skilled immigrant may be inconsistent with today's profile of a highly skilled immigrant. Historically, we've looked to Europe for these skills. Well, among the top 20 countries in Ontario, there's only one European country, and that's Portugal.
Paul, may I just add something to this? I really do believe this is a fundamental question that the country is struggling with. Because I do believe that employer, educator unions, and governments got to be at the same table. In European countries, this tripartite approach to how we do this has worked and worked successfully. Let's take Germany as an example. One of the reasons they're so successful in being an industrial economy, despite the competition from China, is because they don't argue about what's needed. They figure out what do we need to do to make sure that happens. And I think we have been struggling with this model here, how we have this conversation. This is not a one-sided conversation. But without the 4 parties being at the table and participating equally, want to bring their expertise, their advice, and their experience, we're never going to figure out this problem, because every time you say, well, what can we do better? Well, once you ask the people who are on the front lines dealing with the challenges of what we can do better, we're also going to have to figure out a way, because as much as we are doing some training in the workplace, we're not doing enough training in the workplace. You had my colleague here from the auto industry this morning talking. One of the most successful training and retraining that goes on in that sector is they recognize they have to compete, and if they don't have a trained workforce, the industry just dies. So every year the auto industry continue to reinvest billions of dollars to reskill their workforce, because they know the only way they're going to get a skilled workforce, they have to continue to do that. Now, not every employer is able to do that in this country. If you look at OECD data, I think we've got a long way to go to compare to other developed countries. But I do believe the federal government's got an important role. We do give a lot of money to the province under the EI program in terms of what needs to be done around training. But yet there continues to be this mismatch, because I don't believe we have got all the parties at the table who can contribute to this conversation in a way that we used to have some elements of this at one time at the federal level, and we get rid of it. I think we need to recognize it's been missing. It will remain a problem unless we can get people back to the table that can advise both the federal and provincial government how we can do better.
Okay. Sharon, Hodgson, are universities well adapted to this question of permanent lifelong learning? I mean, I went to university, it took a long time, and then I was done. And then that's a very different cycle from the sort of shorter haul, repeated retooling visit.
Well, I won't ask why it took you so long to get through university, but...
They used to sell T-shirts that said Western, 5 or 6 of the best years of my life. And in my case, it was true. Yeah.
I think we're getting there. I don't think that we're there today. On the whole, I mean, a lot of the business schools do a great job with executive education, but that's sort of a different ball. Like we're dealing with senior people in the organization. When you think about offering short micro-certification programs and things like that, I don't think universities have it completely sorted right now. And while I like the idea of a national strategy around this, I'm a little worried about it being over-engineered, because it's pretty easy sometimes to see what the skills gaps are and to build programs to address those skills gaps. And I worry a little bit, and this is a non-academic, in an academic institution, so some of my academic friends, they're looking at me already going, what's she gonna say? It's really hard to get new degree programs out there. It takes 2 to 3 years to get a degree program through all of the processes that you have to go through in the university system and then the government system. I think we can do a little piloting here without trying to build this national strategy and regulations around this. I think we're going to we'll be so slow to, by the time we build the opportunities for these courses, they'll be irrelevant because we're in this dynamic environment. So I think with a little ingenuity, we'll put programs together, and we're already starting to do that for those students that maybe are 2 or 3 or 5 years out of school and then need to be redeployed or get new skills or upskilling. I also think, and I know there's some executive coaches out here, I think coaching is also going to be a good part of this process. So we talk about mentorship. It would be nice, when you're 10 or 15 years into your career, you can maybe afford a coach to have a conversation about, this is kind of what I like to do and where do I go? But kids need that as they're graduating and thinking about their first and second and third jobs and how they need to develop their skills. Even a program like that, I think, would be really helpful in terms of just coaching and helping them to navigate where they could go for various opportunities. So,
it's an interesting thought. You talk about how if you wait for a national strategy, you're going to wait for a long time. I mean, I've been waiting for them to renovate the center block for a long time. And there's a mindset that from the tech industry, which is
they're all over this.
Ship and update, get something out there and then improve it.
Yeah. And there's corporate learning organizations that are all over this space. Microsoft with LinkedIn Learning. You've got TED Talks now. Pardon me? Pluralsight is another. And so, if we wait for the academic institutions to come up with a big policy, that's not, or the government to come up with a big policy, we'll be waiting too long.
Okay. Tabatha or Chianga might want to talk about this because I'm conscious of a possible tension between wanting to get a very young population new into the workplace and keeping older workers on the workplace for longer. Is there a tension there, and how can it be reconciled?
I don't see a tension, because in the circumstances we are in, we need both. The danger I was alluding to earlier is the temptation of focusing too much on age. Young person, lots of points you get in. Slightly older person, not so many points. When in fact, the intermediate career person may bring more to the country. That may be the person who starts a business that employs people. It certainly is better positioned to do that than someone who is in their 20s. Yeah, so I don't see a tension, but I just think we should pay attention to the fact that we need a balance. We cannot go to one extreme or the other.
Okay. Tabatha, do you?
No, I don't think so either. I mean, and I'm very looking forward to retiring at 55. So that's my only tension. I don't want to work that long. No, I think the same, but I also think we see a number of young Indigenous people starting their own business. So the growth of entrepreneurship, particularly in the Indigenous economy, is 9 times the rate of that of non. So and that's another opportunity for them to be able to employ more people as well. So I think we will see this incredible opportunity for youth to be able to create new businesses as they start to learn about entrepreneurship and innovation as well. Now, my only thing on the in-work training is, at the moment, this isn't an answer, this is who has the time? Like if you're in a job and your company's already under-resourced because we're looking for workers and we need workers, It's very difficult to be able to set aside the time for anybody in any level in their career to be able to take that online learning. So I think we also have to try to get our heads around that. And LinkedIn Learning has been great, and there are great programs out there, but we need to, I think, just as industry, as business people who operate businesses, ensure that we're able to fill that time or find that time.
Is there a policy tool to address that worry? Sabbatical grants, things like that?
Yeah. I think you can recognize that as human beings, we all go through lifelong learning. I don't know why anybody thinks this is unique. There's nothing unique about it. We all learn new things every day, but we want to. Why don't we reward people in the fact that, hey, maybe over a 3-year period, you're going to go back and get 3 weeks off. The EI system will support you. Your employer could support you. And you can do something useful in that period, or longer for that matter. But I think at the end of the day, simply thinking that workers aren't trying to figure out how to improve their skills is really not dealing with reality, because everybody knows, you look around, well, the world is changing. So how do we incentivize employer, also workers? This is in your interest to a large extent, because, like it or not, I listen to my young daughter every day. I feel stupid. And I figure, no, I'm not stupid. I just need to learn new things. Because there's things that she could figure out that I'm still trying to understand. How comes her brain moves so fast? I was her age at one time. But I think it speaks to the fact that, all of us have a desire to learn. She teaches me a lot of stuff that I don't have to pay for, but there's also things I could learn on my own if there was an incentive. But I think also, too, recognizing with climate change, there's a whole lot of workers going to go through a huge amount of upskilling and reskilling to stay employed. We need to figure out, how do we bring these workers back into the workforce at the same time, while they may be redundant in a particular sector going forward. And this is a huge challenge for the country, because they may reside in a certain sector of the country, and we don't want to create social tensions to think that somehow we don't value their participation in the economy. So it's critical for us to try to figure this out sooner rather than later, because I think those workers want to contribute. They've got skills already. They can enhance their skills simply by giving them an opportunity to learn new things so they can remain employable.
Okay. We have to get Senator Yussuff to the airport so that they can toss a coin and decide whether he's flying today. So does anyone have questions?
Tabatha, on your comment on the difficulty, the hurdle rate to get into certain programs, and it just seems counterintuitive to have such high hurdle rates. And I know for medical school, I know of someone who tried to get in with an 82% average, could not get into medical school anywhere in Canada. And so when we've got shortages in these key sectors, and we can't have people with 80% averages getting into business schools or medical school, there's just something really broken. So I just wanted to hear from the panel on that. Yeah, I'm happy to. I would make a distinction between certain programs. First of all, a medical school, and I'm not an expert, and I don't play one on TV in this, but I mean, they're capital-intensive programs, and there are a very limited number of spots. So I'm not justifying that, but it is. We have to actually build capacity in the system to be able to take more students right now. In other programs, like in business schools, we can open up the size of our programs and admit more students, and we're doing that to try to get more students and different diverse students into our programs. One of the chronic problems has been that, and I think this is across the country, but for sure it is in Ontario, is that students can't even self-identify that they're Black or Indigenous or a first gen coming into the country. And so you don't know how to, that application needs any separate review. And so we have now just opened up the concept of self-identifying. Tell us who you are. Tell us more about who you are as an individual, so that we can dig into the application more to see if there's, there was significant inequity. So I'll take Ivey as an example. Half of your entry criteria is on leadership, and you have to write some essays on leadership, and you have to tell us about what your leadership experience has been. And we have a program called Equitable Entry for Black students, where we have Black faculty and Black students who have the same lived or similar lived experiences review the application to tell us whether or not the student has demonstrated leadership. Not our traditional faculty who have normally used colonial standards, I will say, to evaluate. So we have to change the process to get more students in. But some of this is capacity. Like for capital-intensive programs, we just need to build capacity to be able to allow more students in. Others, we can broaden the cohort, but we need to know who these students are.
You know what? I understand the value of this conversation, but it doesn't have to stop when the panel leaves the podium anyway. So I'm going to I'll leave them wanting more. A brief summary of the actionable items that have been raised on this stage this afternoon. Finally close the Indigenous education gap after many years of piecemeal efforts. Implement some flexibility on retirement age so that people who want to stay in the workforce and contribute longer are able to and have all of the policy supports that make that a realistic option. Close the gender pay gap for a massive bonanza in the economy and in social justice. Coordinate higher education marketing, at least at the provincial level and perhaps at the national level, so that the world gets a cohesive, simple message about why Canada is a great place to come and start writing the next chapter of your life. Stop using differential tuition fees as a piggy bank, because as our friends down under in Australia have learned, at some point that starts to become a counterproductive strategy. Work harder on introducing mentor, buddy, advocate programs so that people who aren't quite the first arrivers from their population, from their heritage in a new setting can benefit from the people who arrived a little bit ahead of them. The other one I liked is facilitate the notion of an upskilling hiatus. Try and find policy tools to make it feasible to step out of the workplace so that you can step back in with more human capital a little while down the road, thanks to some of these programs. So none of that was my idea. It all comes from them. Thank them for bringing those ideas and the others.